The bells of Ravenrest Cathedral had never rung so long. Seraphina Vale stood pressed against the cold stone of the western gallery, one hand flat against the granite as if the wall alone could hold her upright. Below her, the cathedral nave stretched out in a river of candlelight and silk and bowed heads, and at its far end, on the high marble dais carved with the running wolves of the Iron Fang line, the man she loved was about to take another woman's hand. She should not have come. She had told herself this a dozen times in the last hour. She had told herself it as she crept through the servants' tunnels beneath the palace. She had told herself it as she climbed the narrow stairs to the gallery where no one would think to look. She had told herself it even as her feet refused to turn back, because some part of her still believed, even now, that he would see her, that he would find her face among the shadows, that he would stop. He had not stopped. The High Magister stood beside Calum Draven in robes of deep slate, the ceremonial chain of office heavy on his thin shoulders. The ancient man was speaking, his voice carrying through the great vaulted space with the practiced authority of 1,000 such ceremonies, but Seraphina could not hear the words. Her ears were full of the rushing of her own blood. Her chest was full of a pressure she had never felt before, a tightness behind her ribs that squeezed with every breath. For 4 months, she had been his. In the small hours of the night, when the palace slept and the guards changed at the far towers, he had come to her tiny chamber above the scriptorium, to the records room where she catalogued the histories of the realm, to the cold stone tower that had once belonged to his grandfather and that no one but him had used in 50 years. There, in the highest room of that tower, he had pulled her into his arms and whispered things into her hair that she had not believed any king could mean. "You are mine, Seraphina. Mine in a way no ceremony will ever match. Mine in a way the bond knows even if the council does not." He had taken his knife one night and carved her name into the stone of the windowsill. Just the letters. Just her name. Cut into the granite of a king's private tower, in a place no eye would ever see but his. Soon, he had told her. Just a little longer. The treaty with the Southern Pax has to be signed first. The chancellors have to be managed. The old families have to be brought to heel. She had believed him. She believed him still. That was perhaps the worst of it. Even now, watching him stand beside Lady Isolde Marchwood, some part of Seraphina Vale could not bring herself to call him a liar. Something was wrong. Something had been wrong since the dawn of this morning, when she had passed him in the long corridor, and he had looked through her as if she were a stranger. Calum Draven did not look through people. He saw them. That was the thing about him, the thing she had loved before she had loved anything else about him. He looked at the laundress and saw a woman with 3 children and a husband lost to the northern wars. He looked at the stable boy and saw a young man teaching himself to read in the hour before dawn. He looked at Seraphina, and he had seen her. All of her. The lonely scholar with ink-stained fingers and a head full of histories no one else cared to learn. Today, he had looked through her, and his eyes had been wrong, not cold, not angry, wrong. As if some essential thing inside him had been hollowed out and replaced with something that wore his face, but was not him. The High Magister's voice rose to the formal cadence of the joining oath. Seraphina pressed her forehead against the stone and forced herself to breathe. Calum stood very still on the dais. His shoulders, beneath the ceremonial black and silver, did not move. Lady Isolde stood beside him with her hand resting on his sleeve, her pale gold hair coiled into a crown of braids, her smile small and certain. The Marchwoods had wanted this for 2 generations. The High Chancellor, Isolde's father, stood at the front of the watching nobles with an expression of deep, satisfied calm. Calum of the Iron Fang line, Alpha King of Ravencrest, blood of the High Mountain, the High Magister intoned. Do you take this woman as your bonded queen, to stand at your side in the sight of the moon and the law of the pack? The The silence that followed was the silence of 1,000 held breaths. For one impossible heartbeat, Serafina thought he was going to refuse. Something flickered across his features. Something deep and far away, like a man hearing a sound from the bottom of a well. His brow drew together. His head turned, just a fraction, in the direction of the western gallery. Her hand went to her belly without her thinking about it. She had only known for 11 days. She had been waiting for the right night, for the right hour, for the moment in the carved tower when he would smile down at her, and she would take his hand and place it where the secret was beginning to grow. His head straightened. The flicker left his face. His eyes returned to a point in the middle distance, somewhere above the High Magister's shoulder, and they were empty again. Empty in the way of a window with the shutters closed. "I take this woman," said the Alpha King of Ravenrest, "as my bonded queen." The cathedral erupted. The howl rose first from the nobles of House Marchwood, then from their allied packs, then from the rest of the assembled court, a wall of sound that broke against the stone vaults and echoed back upon itself. Lady Isolde lifted her face to her new mate, and her smile widened into something that might have been called joy if you did not know how to read her. Serafina did not feel herself slide down the wall. She came back to herself on her knees on the cold stone of the gallery floor, one hand still flat against the granite, the other pressed hard against her stomach, as if she could shield the small life inside her from what it had just witnessed. He had not seen her. He had not stopped. He had not even hesitated. Not truly. Only that one strange flicker that might have been only her own desperate eye inventing what was not there. A sound came out of her then, low and broken. She pressed her sleeve against her mouth to stifle it. She would not be heard. She would not be the scandal whispered through the kitchens for the next 10 years, the foolish scribe who had believed a king's promises and shattered in a stairwell. She rose. Her legs would not hold her at first, and she stayed pressed against the wall until they did. Her quarters were in the lower scriptorium, 3 floors down and across 2 courtyards. She did not run. She walked with the controlled, downcast pace of any servant returning to her work during a great occasion, and she kept her face hidden in the hood of her gray wool cloak. Her chamber was a narrow room with a single window beneath a slanting roof. She had loved it once, because it had been hers, and because Caleb had once climbed the back stair in the rain and stood dripping in her doorway and laughed at the smallness of the bed. She did not let herself think of that now. She moved like a woman in a fever. She pulled her traveling satchel from beneath the cot. She folded 2 dresses, the brown and the gray. She wrapped her mother's pendant in a strip of linen. She took the small purse of silver she had been saving for a winter cloak. She took her writing kit. She took her warm boots. She did not take anything he had given her. There was only one thing he had given her that she could not leave behind, and that thing was inside her, and it would come with her, whether she willed it or not. She paused only once, at the window. Below her, the courtyards of the palace blazed with torchlight, and the bells went on ringing. Serafina pressed her fingertips to the cold glass. "I hope she makes you happy," she whispered, and her voice was steadier than she expected. "I hope you find in her arms whatever it was you could not find in mine." She drew the hood of her cloak up over her dark hair. She closed her eyes. The shadow gift had been hers since childhood. Her grandmother had taught her, in the pine forests of the eastern coast, how to step from one darkness into another. Her grandmother had told her, with great seriousness, that a woman who showed too much of her gift would be hunted for it. She had not used it once in all her years at Ravenrest. Tonight, she used it. The shadow at the foot of her cot swallowed her like cold water. She stepped out into the deeper shadow at the base of the southern wall of the palace, beyond the outer kitchens, beyond the last torch. The night air struck her face. She did not look back at the lit windows. She did not look back at the high black silhouette of the carved tower, where her name was cut into a windowsill no one would ever read. She walked into the dark. Far above her, in a tower she did not look toward, a man with empty eyes stood before a window and felt, very faintly, as if some thread tied to his ribs had just been cut. He did not understand the feeling. He could not name what he had lost. A long time later, deep in the night, a sound rose from the carved tower at the far end of the palace. It was not a howl, not exactly. It was the sound of a man waking from a dream he could not remember, and finding that something he could not name had been taken from him while he slept. The guards who heard it told no one, because they could not have explained what it was they had heard. The Alpha King stood at the windowsill of the highest room of his grandfather's tower. His fingers found, in the dark, the letters carved into the granite. He traced them without seeing them. He did not yet know whose name they were. 5 years passed. Hollowmere was a town built on cliffs. It clung to the gray rock of the western coast like a colony of seabirds, narrow houses leaning against each other for warmth, slate roofs slick with the constant mist that rose from the sea below. The fishermen went out before dawn and came back at dusk. The market opened on 3 days of the week. The bell of the small chapel rang at noon and at sunset, and the rest of the time, the only sound was the wind off the water and the cry of the gulls, and, sometimes, the laughter of children playing in the cobbled square. Seraphina Vale, who in Hollowmere was known as Mira Aldenwood, kept the small lending library in the row of houses above the harbor. It was a strange occupation for a coastal town. Most of Hollowmere did not read, and those who did had little time for it. But there were the children, and there were the merchants who came up from the southern ports with their cargo manifests, and there was the harbor master who needed a clean hand for his correspondence. So Mira Aldenwood made enough to keep a small cottage at the end of the cliff lane. She was known as a quiet widow. The townspeople had decided, during her first winter among them, that her husband had died at sea, and she had not corrected them. Her son was 4 years old, and he was the heart of every breath she drew. His name was Thorn. He had her dark hair and her quiet hands. He had a way of sitting very still and listening to grown-ups talk that made the fisherwomen call him an old soul. He laughed easily. He cried rarely. He brought home small treasures from the tide pools and lined them up on the windowsill of their cottage, and he gave each one a name because he was a child who believed that everything that existed deserved to be called something. His eyes were the color of molten gold. They had not been when he was born. Mira remembered the morning she had brought him into the world, alone, in a small cottage outside an inland town called Renfell, with only an old midwife to help her. His eyes had been the dark slate of all newborn babies. She had been grateful in those first weeks. She had hoped he would have her coloring. Then he had turned 3 months old, and his eyes had begun to change. By the time he could sit up unaided, they were the gold of his father's wolf form. By the time he could walk, they were unmistakable. Mira had stood in front of the small looking-glass above her wash basin one morning, with her son on her hip, and she had understood that the fiction she had built around her life had a fault running through it that no amount of careful stitching could ever quite close. So she had moved them, that first time, from Renfell to the coast. The truth was that she had needed to be somewhere no one would have any reason to remember the color of an Alpha King's eyes. In Hollowmere, no one had ever seen the King of Ravenrest. The fisherwomen looked at Thorn and clucked their tongues and said only that he had unusual eyes. What a pretty boy. What a strange and pretty boy. Mira had let them say it. She had stopped flinching after the first year. She had taught herself to look at her son's eyes and see only her son. The mark on her hip, where Calem's teeth had once broken her skin, had not faded. It had paled to silver, but it had not faded. Sometimes, on the coldest nights of the winter, she would feel a flicker of warmth in it, a phantom pulse, as if some thread that should have been cut was still attached at the other end. She had tried, in the first year, to understand what it meant. The books in the library disagreed with each other. Some said the bond severed completely upon a public joining. Some said it took years to fade. Some said it never faded at all, in the rarest of cases. Mira had closed the books and stopped reading them. She had her son. She had her library. She had her cottage and her herb garden and her quiet life. The realm had not heard a whisper of Calum searching. The news sheets spoke only of treaties and harvests. They did not speak of a king tearing the realm apart for a missing scribe. She woke that morning before the dawn. Thorn was still asleep on the small cot beside her bed, one fist curled under his chin, his dark hair sticking up at the crown. Mira lay watching him for a long moment. She had developed a habit of watching him sleep before each day began, as if to fix his face in her memory against some loss she could not name. She rose. She built up the fire in the small hearth and set the kettle. She stepped out into the back garden and cut a sprig of rosemary and a sprig of mint for the morning's tea. The mist was heavy off the sea today. The cliff lane was a soft gray corridor. It was the kind of morning on which nothing should happen. Mira returned to the cottage and woke her son with her hand on his hair. Thorn sat up sleepily and reached his arms up to her, and she lifted him against her shoulder. "Mama," he said. "Yes, my heart. There is a man at our door." Mira went very still. Her arms tightened around her son before she could think about it. "What man?" "He is not there yet," Thorn said in the matter-of-fact voice of a 4-year-old. "But he is coming. I saw him in the dream. He was looking for us." Mira drew back enough to look into her son's face. His golden eyes were calm, untroubled, the eyes of a child who had simply mentioned what the weather would be. "What did he look like, my heart?" "Tall. Sad. Like you, when you stand by the window." The kettle began to whistle on the hearth. "Did he have a name?" she asked, very carefully. "The man in the dream?" Thorn thought about it. He furrowed his small brow in the way that always made her chest tighten, because it was exactly the way his father had furrowed his brow over a difficult treaty. "No," he said at last. "He did not say his name, but he knew yours, Mama." "Mine?" He said the wrong one. Thorn looked up at her with those calm gold eyes and smiled a small, puzzled smile. "He said the name you used to have. Before." The kettle screamed. Mira moved at last, pulling it from the fire with hands that shook so badly she nearly dropped it. She set it on the iron trivet. She pressed her palms flat against the stone of the mantel and breathed. Thorn had gone back to walking the wooden horse along the floor, humming a small wordless tune to himself. He had no idea what he had said. She had never spoken her old name in his hearing. There was no way her son could have learned it from her. The bond, she thought, with a calm that surprised her. The thread that should have severed and had not. Their child, born of 2 bloodlines, one of them royal and ancient and full of magics no one had fully catalogued. He had dreamed his father. She crossed to her son and knelt and pulled him into her arms. He patted her cheek with one small hand. "Mama, you are crying." "I am only tired, my heart." "Will the man be a kind man?" "I do not know, my heart. I do not know yet." She held him for a long time. The day went on as days do. She opened the library at the second bell. She copied 2 letters for the harbor master. She taught the small group of children their letters in the back room, and Thorn sat among them on the rug and traced his own letters in chalk on a slate. She tried to forget what her son had said. She was almost succeeding when, late in the afternoon, the woman who ran the bakery came into the library to return a book of recipes and paused at the counter. "There is a procession on the coast road, Mira. Did you hear? Banners of the high mountain. Coming this way. They are saying it will be in Hollowmere by tomorrow's dusk." Mira's hand closed very slowly on the edge of the counter. "The Iron Fang colors?" the baker said, pleased at her own news. "Imagine. The king himself, or his envoys at the least. There has not been a royal procession in Hollowmere in my whole life. Outside the library window, Thorn sat on the low wall in a patch of late sunlight, swinging his small legs and humming his wordless tune. The light caught his face at the angle Mira had taught herself to dread. His eyes burned gold. She did not sleep that night. She lay in her bed with Thorn curled against her side, his small breath even and warm in the dark. And she thought about running. She had thought about running before, many times. She had a small purse of silver hidden in the loose stone behind the hearth. She had a traveling satchel still rolled beneath her bed. She had taught herself never to become a woman who could not leave a place within an hour of deciding to. She could be on the coast road by dawn. She had the routes mapped in her head. But she did not move. Something held her there. The same thread that had been pulsing faintly in her hip was pulsing now, more strongly, and she lay in the dark and listened to it the way another woman might have listened for a knock at the door. He was coming. She did not know if it was him personally or only his envoys, or only his banners on a road that happened to pass through her town. The chances, she told herself fiercely, were that this was nothing. But Thorn had dreamed him. Thorn had dreamed him, and Thorn had said her name. She lay in the dark and watched the pale square of moonlight on the cottage wall, and she did not move, because some old and unkillable part of her was waiting. When the dawn came, she rose. She dressed Thorn in his small gray tunic. She walked him to the door of the bakery and asked the baker, who loved Thorn as her own grandchildren, to keep him for the morning. The baker kissed Thorn on the top of his head and put a sweet roll into his small hand. Mira walked down to the harbor. She did not have errands at the harbor. She walked instead to the high promontory on the north side of the town, where the old watchtower stood, half ruined, looking out over the long curve of the coast road. She climbed the broken stair to the top. She saw them at the 3rd hour after dawn. The mist had lifted. The day was clear and cold, and the coast road ran like a pale ribbon along the cliff edge, and the procession was a slow, dark shape moving against the pale, with the colors of the high mountain rippling above it in the wind. She counted 6 riders in the vanguard. She counted the standards, and the largest of them bore the running wolf of the Iron Fang line in silver against deep slate. Her hands had begun to shake on the stones of the parapet. She made herself stand and watch until she could see the riders' faces. She could not see his. The vanguard was made up of men in slate cloaks, and one of them rode at the center with the bearing of command, but he wore his hood up against the wind off the sea, and his face was only a shadow inside the slate. She knew it was him before she could have given a single reason why. Her body knew. Her hip knew. The thread that ran behind her ribs and out through her flesh and across so many miles knew. She stood on the broken tower and she watched her bonded mate ride toward the town she had hidden in, and the tightness behind her ribs, the tightness she had taught herself not to feel, came uncoiled in her chest like a thing waking up. She turned. She climbed down faster than was safe. She walked back into the town with her hood up and her head down, and she went to the bakery, and she collected her son, and she carried him home. She set him on the rug. She knelt in front of him. My heart, listen to me. There is a man coming to Hollowmere today, a great man, with many soldiers. I want you to stay in the cottage with me until he is gone. I want you to play here, on the rug, and I want you not to go to the window. Do you understand? Is he the man from the dream? Her throat closed. I do not know, my heart. If he is the kind man, I want to see him. You cannot see him today, Thorn, please. For me. Her son studied her face. All right, Mama, I will not go to the window. She kissed his forehead. She rose and pulled the traveling satchel out from beneath her bed and checked it. She added bread. She added cheese. She added an apple for Thorn. She rolled it and set it by the back door. She would wait until full dark. She would go out the back garden and down the goat path that ran behind the cottages. She was almost ready when she crossed to the front window to draw the shutter. The square below was beginning to fill. She had not realized, lost in her preparations, how late it had grown. The sun was already low over the western water. The townspeople were gathering, drawn by the slow rumor of arrival, and the children were running between the legs of the adults, and the harbor master stood in the center in his best coat, looking nervous and pleased. At the far end of the square, the procession was coming up the cliff lane. She could see the dark cloaks. She could see the rider at the center, and his hood was no longer up, because the wind had dropped, and his hair was the same dark hair she had once wound her fingers into in the small room above the scriptorium. She could not move. She watched Calum Draven, Alpha King of Ravenrest, ride into the cobbled square of the town she had hidden in, and she could not breathe. He looked older. That was the first thing she registered. His face was drawn, the cheekbones sharper than she remembered, the line of his jaw harder. His shoulders, beneath the slate cloak, sat at an angle she did not know. The angle of a man carrying a weight that had been put on him so long ago that he had forgotten what it was like to stand without it. He was being courteous to the harbor master's nervous welcome. She could see the difference. He was being a king at a small town's reception, and he was doing it well. And he was not present in his own face. The empty look. The same empty look he had worn on the dais. But it was not the same. The emptiness now had something behind it, a long grief that had hollowed itself a permanent place. The emptiness then had been imposed on him from outside, a stranger wearing his features. The emptiness now was his. She heard behind her the small voice of her son. "Mama, the kind man is here." She turned. Thorn stood in the middle of the rug with his wooden horse in one hand. His golden eyes were fixed on the door. "Thorn," she said, kneeling, "you have to stay inside this cottage. Whatever you feel, whatever you think you know, you have to stay. Promise me." "I promise, Mama." She kissed his forehead. She rose and went back to the window. The procession had reached the center of the square. The dark riders had dismounted. Calum stood among them, taller than most. A child ran across the square. It was the miller's youngest girl. She had stayed in the square to watch the great procession with the other children, and she was running now, after a small gray cat that had darted through the legs of the dark riders, and she was running directly toward the cottage at the end of the cliff lane. The cat shot under Mira's front step. The child stopped at the door, breathless, laughing, and she saw through the open shutter of the front window the small dark-haired boy standing on the rug inside, and she waved at him with the easy openness of a 6-year-old. "Thorn, Thorn, come and see! The king has come to the town." Mira's son, who had promised his mother he would not go to the window, did not move from the rug. He kept his promise. He stood very still with his wooden horse in his hand, and he turned his face toward the open window in the simple obedience of a child who had been told not to go and not been told not to look. His golden eyes lifted to the square. In the square, 50 paces away, the Alpha King of Ravenrest, who had been answering some courteous question of the harbor master's, lifted his head sharply, as if he had heard a sound no one else had heard. His face turned. His eyes, the same molten gold as the eyes of the small boy in the window, swept the row of cottages. They stopped on Mira's window. They stopped on her son. The world stopped with them. Calum Draven stood very still in the center of the square. Around him, the dark riders sensed the change in their king and went still also, hands drifting toward sword hilts without knowing why. The Alpha King looked at the small boy in the window. The small boy looked back. Mira stood at her son's shoulder, hidden by the angle of the wall, with her hand pressed over her mouth and her heart breaking open in her chest. She watched the man she had loved across all the years of silent sea. For the first time in his life, the child she had carried away from him into the dark. Calum's hand rose, very slowly, to his own chest. He pressed it flat over his heart. the way a man might press his hand to a wound he had not known he was carrying. His mouth shaped a word. Mira, behind the wall, could not hear it. But she could read the shape of it on her bonded mate's lips. It was her name, her old name. Caleb Draven took one step forward, and then another. And then he was walking, very slowly, very deliberately, across the cobbled square of Hollowmere toward the cottage at the end of the cliff lane, with his dark riders falling in behind him and the harbor master forgotten in the middle of his unfinished sentence. In the window, the small boy with golden eyes set his wooden horse very carefully on the sill. "Mama," said Thorn without turning. "He is coming to the door." Mira did not move from the window. She watched Caleb cross the square the way a woman watches a wave that has already left the deep water and is coming for the shore. There was no point in running now. The thread that ran from her hip to his chest had been pulling at both of them for years, and it had brought him here. She did what she could. She crossed the room in 3 strides and lifted Thorn from the rug and carried him to the back of the cottage. She set him on the narrow bed in the small alcove behind the curtain. "My heart, stay here, behind this curtain. Whatever you hear, you do not come out. Promise me." "Will you be all right, Mama?" "Yes." "You are lying." She did not have time to wonder how he knew. She kissed his forehead. "I am trying very hard not to be lying. Stay behind the curtain. I promise." She drew the heavy wool curtain across the alcove. She crossed back to the center of the cottage and stood very still on the rug. The knock came. It was not a knock. It was the press of an open palm against the wood, slow and careful, the touch of a man who did not trust his own hand. Mira drew the bolt. She opened the door. Caleb Draven stood on her step. He was taller than she remembered, or he had grown thinner, and the height showed more. His slate cloak hung from his shoulders as if it weighed too much. His dark hair was longer than he had ever worn it at court, threaded with gray at the temples that had not been there before. His face was the face she had loved, and the face of a stranger at once, and his eyes were the gold of his wolf form, and they were full of tears. He did not speak. He looked at her. She had thought, in her preparations, that the first thing she would feel would be anger. She had been ready for anger. She had stockpiled it for all the long, quiet years. She felt no anger. She felt only the unbearable familiarity of him, the exact angle of his jaw, the exact line of his mouth. Her body recognized him before her mind had finished deciding what to do, and the mark on her hip flared with a heat she had not felt in a long time. "Seraphina," he said. It was barely a word. It came out of him as if he had been carrying it in his mouth and was only now allowed to set it down. She did not answer. He held himself in the doorway with the discipline of a man who knew that any wrong motion would shatter what was left of him. "May I come in?" he said, "and speak to you." The crossbow bolt struck the door frame above her head. It came from the rooftop across the lane. It buried itself in the wood with a sound like a hand striking a drum, and a thin curl of dark liquid ran down the shaft. Caleb moved before she understood what had happened. He pushed her backward into the cottage with one arm, his body turning to put itself between her and the lane, and a snarl came out of him that was not a human sound. His dark riders were already in motion. 2 of them broke for the rooftop. 2 more closed around the door. A 5th, a tall man with silver at his temples, drew a long knife and put his back to the doorframe. Caleb stepped through the threshold and pulled the door shut behind him with his heel. His chest was heaving. His golden eyes were on her face, scanning for any sign that the bolt had touched her. And when he found none, his shoulders dropped a finger's breadth, and a sound came out of him that was almost a sob. "Thorn," Mira said. She broke from him and ran to the curtain. She pulled it back. Her son was sitting cross-legged on the bed with his hands pressed over his ears and his golden eyes very wide. He had not cried out. He looked at her, and then past her at the man in the slate cloak, and his small mouth opened slightly. "Mama, it is the man from the dream." Caleb had stopped behind her as if he had walked into a wall. He stood in the doorway of the alcove with his hand still half raised toward her shoulder, and his eyes were on the small boy on the bed, and Mira heard very clearly the moment his breath left him. "Sweet moon," he said. It was a prayer. Outside, the second bolt thrower fell from the rooftop with a wet sound. The dark riders had run him to ground. Caleb sank very slowly to one knee. He did not reach for the boy. He did not speak to him. He looked at his son's face, and he looked at his son's hair. And he looked, last and longest, at his son's eyes. Tears ran down his face without any sound. "Serafina," he said softly, without taking his gaze from the boy. "How old is he?" Her voice came from somewhere far away. "4." He closed his eyes. "And his name?" "Thorn. Thorn," he repeated. The boy on the bed studied this strange, tall man kneeling on the floorboards. He did not seem afraid. He never seemed afraid. He slid down off the bed and walked, very deliberately, the 3 steps it took to bring him in front of the kneeling king. Thorn reached out one small hand and laid it on the wet place on Caleb's cheek. "You are sad inside." The Alpha King of Ravenrest, who had ridden with armies and broken treaties, lowered his head onto his own knee and wept. The silver-haired officer came in from the front of the cottage at a quick, careful pace. He took in the scene in the alcove in a single glance, stepped back to the front room, and closed the door. Mira sank down onto the floorboards beside her son and her bonded mate. She did not touch Caleb. She could not. Yet. There was too much in the way. But she put her hand on her son's back, and after a long time, Caleb lifted his head. He took one of Thorn's small hands in his own enormous one, with the care of a man handling something that might shatter at a touch. "My name is Caleb. I am very glad to meet you, Thorn." "You are crying." "I am. Yes." "Why?" His gaze lifted, past his son, to Mira's face. He held her eyes for a long moment. Then he looked back at his boy. "Because I have been looking for you. For a very long time. And I did not know your name." Thorn nodded slowly. He patted the wet cheek with his small palm. Then he turned and climbed back up onto the bed and picked up his wooden horse. "You can sit down, please," he said politely. "Mama, the man can sit down, can he not?" Mira's laugh came out of her on a half sob. She nodded. Caleb rose carefully from his knees. He did not sit on the bed. He sat on the floor beside it, his long legs folded, his slate cloak puddled around him, and he watched his son walk the wooden horse along the patchwork blanket with an expression that was no longer quite grief. It was something more like wonder. Mira pulled the curtain halfway across for a small dignity and rose and went into the front room. The silver-haired officer turned from the door. "My lady," he said and bowed. "Please do not call me that." "As you wish. My name is Renwick Hale. I have served the Alpha King for 19 years. I am his first beta." Mira nodded. She crossed to the front window. The lane outside was full of dark riders now. 2 of them stood over a body on the cobbles. The body wore the dull leathers of a road traveler, and a wolf skull token hung at its belt on a black cord. "Marchwood," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," Hale said. "The Chancellor has agents on every road his daughter is afraid the king might travel. They followed our procession from the harbor at Graycombe." "Does she know he is here?" "She knew the moment we left the capital. She does not know yet what the king has found here. She will know within the hour." Mira closed her eyes. "Master Hale, tell me what happened to him. The night of the joining. Tell me all of it." From beyond the curtain came the very small sound of a wooden horse being walked along a blanket, and a man's deep voice asking, very gently, what the horse was called. "Bramble, sir." "Bramble." That is a fine name for a horse, Hale told her. He told her about the cup of dark wine the High Chancellor had pressed into the king's hand at the 3rd hour after sunset. The slow draining of presence from his eyes within the half-hour, the council's careful staging of the ceremony, the way Lady Isolde had been moved into position before the king's senses had fully gone. He told her that within the hour after the joining, the king had been carried to the carved tower, and had not been seen by any common eye for 3 days. He told her about the morning of the 3rd day, about Calum waking with no memory and standing at the windowsill with his hand on the carved letters, and turning to Hale and saying, "Where is she? Where has she gone? Bring her to me." He did not know he was bonded, Hale said quietly. He could remember nothing of you, except a feeling of having lost something he could not name. We told him your name. It took 3 days for him to remember it. A week for him to remember your face. 2 weeks before the bond reasserted itself fully, and he understood what had been done. And by then, I was 400 miles away? By then, you were nowhere we could find. He searched, my lady. For 4 years. He sent riders to every village in the realm. He rode himself to half of them. He aged 10 years in 4. At the end of the 4th year, the council came to him in a body, and they told him that the realm was failing because their alpha was breaking, and that he had to choose between his lost mate and his kingdom. He chose his kingdom. He has not smiled in a year. He stopped looking. He stopped sending riders. He never stopped looking. He passes through this town today because he was told there had been a sighting at Graycombe of a woman with dark hair and a young son, and even now, he could not stop himself. Mira had her hand pressed flat against the cold glass of the window. And the bond? Why has it not faded? That is the other thing I must tell you. There is an artifact. An old thing. It belonged once to the founders of House Marchwood, who came down out of the high mountain with relics older than the line of kings. It is called the Severance Stone. It is kept in the inner vault of the Marchwood seat. It does not break a bond. It binds the bond in chains. It muffles it. It keeps the bonded pair from finding each other through the thread that should pull them together. That is why the mark has not faded. Yes, the stone is still active. We could not destroy it. We could not approach it. The Marchwood Vault is the most defended room in the realm outside of the Iron Fang treasury. The stone has to be broken. Yes, or the bond will never come back. And without it, fully restored, he will go feral. Eventually. Mira pressed both her hands over her face. She stood like that for a long time. The light through the front window had begun to go gold. From the alcove behind her, she could hear the deep, careful voice of her son's father, asking which of the shells he had found first. She lowered her hands. "Master Hale, we are not safe here. They will come for you within the hour." She nodded. She crossed the room and pulled back the curtain. Calum looked up. His son was sitting on his lap, asleep against his chest, the wooden horse still gripped in one small hand. His golden eyes met hers over their child's dark hair, and Mira saw the man she had loved. Not the empty puppet of the dais, not the hollowed-out grief of the king in the square. Him, the man from the highest room of the carved tower. The man who had whispered her name into her hair and meant it. The bond, suppressed for so long, flickered to life behind her ribs like a held breath, finally let out. It was only a flicker. The severance stone was still doing its work. But through the iron of it, for one moment she felt him. She felt him searching. She felt him now, holding their son, asking her without any words at all whether she would let him try. "Yes," she said aloud. "Yes, we try." Calum closed his eyes. He bowed his head over his son's hair. Outside, in the gold light of the late afternoon, the second wave of Marchwood's people began to ride into Hollowmere from the south. They left the cottage within the half-hour. Mira took only the traveling satchel and Thorn's small wooden horse. She left the books on the shelves. She left the kettle on the iron trivet. She carried her sleeping son out the back door into the herb garden, and Caleb walked behind her with one hand on the small of her back, as if he could not quite believe she would still be there if he stopped touching her. Hale had a horse waiting at the end of the goat path. Two of the dark riders had brought up a second horse and a small traveling cart for the boy. Mira lifted Thorn into the cart and tucked the wool blanket around him. She kissed his forehead. She turned to Caleb. I do not yet know what I am going to say to you. I know. I am furious with you. I know. I am also. Her voice caught. I am also very glad that you came. His golden eyes filled. We will talk on the road. There is no part of these years I will let you keep from me. There is no part I would keep from you. Mira, she said. Here. I am Mira. Where another ear can hear, I am Mira. Promise me. He nodded. He took her hand briefly and helped her up onto the second horse. They rode out of Hollowmere by the south road, in the gold light, and 4 Marchwood agents lay crumpled in the lane behind them, and the gulls cried overhead, and Mira did not look back. They rode until full dark and stopped at a small abandoned chapel a league inland, the stone walls intact, the roof half fallen. Hale set the men to a perimeter. 2 of them built a small fire in the chapel's old hearth. Mira carried Thorn, still sleeping, into the corner where the wall was whole, and made a bed for him on the wool blanket and her own folded cloak. Caleb sat down on the cold flagstones across from her, with the fire between them. For a long time, neither of them spoke. It was Caleb who spoke first. I would understand if you sent me away. If you took the boy and went south, and I never saw either of you again. I have no claim on you that I did not forfeit on a marble dais. I am asking only to help you survive what is coming. After it is done, you may do as you choose. You do not understand me as well as you used to. He flinched. I am not going to send you away. I spent a long time telling myself you had chosen her. I told myself this every morning when I built up the fire. I told myself this when the mark on my hip would not stop pulsing. I did not yet know about the stone. I did not yet know that what I was feeling was not a phantom, but a current. I told myself I had been a fool to believe what you whispered to me in the carved tower. Seraphina. And in all those years I never stopped loving you. He went still. I tried. I made lists, in my head, of all your faults. I built, around the small green place in my chest where you lived, a wall of stone. And every morning, when I woke, I found that the wall had a door in it, and the door was open, and you were standing in it. Tears were running down his face. And then today, you came to my door. And the mark woke up, and I felt you. For one moment, when you sat in our son's alcove with our son in your arms, I felt you. The stone is still working, but for one moment I felt you. And what I felt was not the man who had betrayed me. What I felt was a man who had been searching for me, every hour of every day. He sat with his hands open on his knees and the firelight on his wet face. I am not going to send you away. Not when I have just learned that I never lost you. Not when our son has just met his father. Do you understand me? Yes. Then come and sit beside me. The fire is between us, and I have spent too long in the cold. He rose. He came around the small fire with the slow care of a man approaching something fragile. He sat down beside her, and after a long moment, Mira leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and he set his face against her hair. Tell me everything, she said. He told her. He told her about the morning he had woken in the carved tower with no memory of the night before. About the moment, 3 days later, when Hale had said the name Seraphina to him and his knees had given out. About the year he had spent in the saddle. About the southern marshes. About the night he had crouched on the bank of a river outside a village called Sherwin because a woman with dark hair and a child had been seen there, and he had watched her come out of her cottage in the morning, and she had not been her, and he had ridden away without showing himself. He told her about the council finally pressing him to stop, about the long stretch of sitting on his throne with a stone where his heart had been, about the night, 4 months ago, when Hale had brought him word of a sighting on the western coast. I almost did not come into Hollowmere. Hale asked me whether, if it turned out to be you, I could live with the knowledge that I had ridden past. I could not answer him. So we came into the town. She said nothing for a long time. And the boy, Thorn. You were going to be told the night of the joining. I had practiced the words. I had wanted to take your hand and put it on my belly, where he was just beginning. Sweet moon. He was born outside Renfell. The midwife was a woman named Brenna who never asked me a single question I did not want to answer. And his eyes? They were gray at first. They changed in the 3rd month. He laughed, very softly, against her hair. It was a small broken sound. Of course they were. It is why we left Renfell. It is why we came to Hollowmere. I am so sorry. I would not have let you carry 1 hour of it alone if I had known. I know that now. A small voice came from the wool blanket on her other side. Mama? She turned. Thorn was sitting up in his nest of blankets with his dark hair tousled and his golden eyes very wide in the firelight. He was looking at his father. Caleb drew his arm back slowly, as if he were not sure he was permitted to be seen embracing her. Mira reached out and took his hand and held it firmly on her knee where her son could see it. My heart. Are you all right? I had a dream. The kind man was crying. Thorn picked up his wooden horse from the blanket. He climbed out of his nest and came around the fire to them. You can sit down, please. I am sitting down, Thorn. You can keep sitting down then. Are you the man who was looking for us? Yes. Why did you not find us before? Caleb looked at his son. There was a thing. A bad thing. A piece of stone. Far away from here. That some bad people were using to hide you from me. Is it still hiding us? It is still trying to. Thorn nodded slowly. He climbed up onto Caleb's lap as if he had been doing it every night of his small life. He set the wooden horse on Caleb's knee and walked it carefully along the slate cloak. He hummed his small wordless tune. He looked up at his father. You are still sad inside. Caleb's hand tightened on Mira's. Yes. Why? Because I missed many years of you. Thorn thought about this. He looked at Mira. He looked back at Caleb. With the unanswerable logic of a child who had learned the shape of his own life from the inside, he said, But I am here now. The Alpha King of Ravenrest pressed his face into the dark hair of his son. Hale stepped quietly into the chapel. He waited a respectful distance away. He came forward and said, in a voice carefully pitched not to disturb the boy, My king, my lady, there is news from Ravenrest. Caleb lifted his face from his son's hair. Hale held out a folded paper. The seal was broken. The wax was the deep slate of the Marchwood line. Caleb took it. He read it. The color went out of his face. He passed it to her. The Marchwood households, in the 5 days of the king's absence, had carried out a coordinated movement. The High Chancellor had stood before the council and announced, with grave reluctance, that the Alpha King of Ravenrest had been found dead on the Western Road, set upon by bandits during a small treaty mission. Lady Isolde Marchwood had been declared regent pending the formal succession. The severance stone had been brought up from the inner vault and mounted in the throne room at full power. They are saying you are dead. Yes. The succession ceremony begins in 3 days, Hale said. It will not be reversible by argument once it is complete. We have 3 days, my king, to enter the city, reach the throne room, and break the stone. Caleb looked down at his son, asleep against his chest. He looked at his bonded mate. Then we ride at dawn. She lifted her son very gently out of his father's arms and settled him back into the nest of blankets. She turned to Calum. All of us. I am not staying behind. The road will be hunted. The city will be sealed. All of us, Calum. He looked at her in the firelight. His golden eyes did the thing they had done in the alcove. He did not argue. All of us. They rode at dawn. The road inland from the coast climbed slowly through low hills covered in heather, then through long pine forests, and then out onto the high stone plateau that fell, after 3 days' ride, toward the walled city of Ravenrest. They rode hard. Hale set the pace. Thorn rode in front of his mother in the saddle of her horse, wrapped in her cloak with her arm around him. He was a quiet traveler. The dark riders, hard men who had ridden with Calum through 3 winter wars, became, in the space of half a day, a company of uncles. The youngest of them, a man named Jorvin Crail, found a smooth river stone in the bed of a creek and gave it to Thorn without a word. Calum watched all of this from his own saddle, half a length behind, and he did not interfere. He had taken the position of guardian rather than father. He left the holding of Thorn to Mira. He left the small kindnesses to his men. He did not push himself forward. Mira saw what he was doing, and she let him do it. He was a man who had been given, in the space of an evening, the fact of a son he had not known existed, and he was afraid of taking too much at once. It was on the second day that Hale rode up beside her at a halt and spoke very quietly. "My lady, there is a hand in our camp that is not mine. I have suspected it since the first night. None of it on its own is anything. Together it is the work of a man leaving signs for an outside reader. By tonight I will know who. I have set a small trap." That evening, after Thorn had gone to sleep in the small tent the riders had pitched, Hale came to the fire and sat down across from Calum and Mira, and he named a man, Jorvin Crail. Calum's face did not change. He nodded once. "His brother." "Yes, my king. They took the boy 3 months ago. He is held in the lower cell of the Marchwood seat. They have promised him the brother alive if he gives them the king's road." Calum was silent for a long time. "Bring him to me, Hale, quietly. Now." Hale rose and came back in a few minutes with the youngest rider. Crail knelt in front of his king at the edge of the fire. He did not look up. "My king." "Crail, I am asking for nothing. I am asking only that you take my life cleanly, and that if you can, when this is done, you do not let them take my brother's." "Look at me, Crail." The young rider lifted his face. "When I rode out of Ravencrest 2 years ago into the southern marshes, I went in with 20 men and came back with 12. Of the 8 I lost, 1 was your father. He fell at the river crossing at Tarn Lake so that I could keep my saddle. I have not forgotten his face. Do you think I am the kind of man, Crail, who lets House Marchwood have your brother now?" The young rider's face crumpled. He pressed his fist to his mouth. "You should have come to me, Crail, the day they took him. I would have moved the realm. I was afraid. I know. I am not punishing fear. I am punishing concealment, and the punishment will be that you ride at my side into the city tomorrow night, and you bring your brother home with your own hands. Do you understand me?" The young rider nodded. "Go and sleep, Crail." The rider bowed his head almost to the ground and left the fire. Hale watched him go. "You will need to feed him false news now, until we move. Tell him what to feed them. Make the false news what we need them to believe." Mira leaned her head against Calum's shoulder. He laid his cheek on her hair. "You are a good man, Calum Draven. I am a man who has lost a great deal of time. I am trying to be more careful with what is left." The 3rd day was the longest. They rode from before dawn until full dark. The plateau gave way at last in the late afternoon to the long descent toward the valley of Ravencrest, and as the sun went down behind them, Mira saw, for the first time in years, the high black walls of the city she had walked out of into the dark. She had not thought she would see them again. The party drew up at a high outcrop 2 miles from the city. Hale rode forward to the ridge with the king. Mira followed. The three of them stood on the ridge and looked down at Ravenrest. "The gates are sealed," Hale said. "All four. There has been no traffic in 2 days." "Then we go in by the old way." Hale turned to her. "There is a tunnel, my lady, beneath the eastern wall. It was dug in the time of the king's grandfather. It is known to perhaps 6 people in the world. It comes up in the cellar of the old armory, which has been disused for 30 years. From the armory, the route to the throne room is through 3 corridors and 1 stair. And the stone, mounted in the throne room, on a plinth of black iron behind the throne, it will be guarded. And the boy, he stays in the camp, with 4 of my men. He will be safe." "No, my lady." "Hale, my son told me this morning that we were going to a room with a stone in it. I did not tell him about the stone. Caleb did not tell him about the stone. He has heard us speak of it only as a thing far away. He told me also that when we got to the room, the stone would be lying. He said it the way a child says a fact about a horse." Hale looked at her for a long moment. "Sweet moon, my king." Caleb's golden eyes were on his city. "What is he, Hale?" "There were stories, when I was young, of children born of the very rare bonds, the true bonds, who could see false things for what they were. The Marchwoods took those children, when they could find them. The line was nearly extinct. He breaks lies, my king. He sees them. Whether he can break them, I do not know. Then he comes with us. He has the only thing in this realm that the Marchwoods do not have a counter for. We do this as a family, or we do not do it at all." They returned to the camp. It was Mira who sensed the wrongness first. She felt it as they came down off the ridge, a cold tightening at the back of her neck. She rode in among the wagons. She looked for her son. He was not by the fire. He was not in the small tent. She slid from her horse and called his name, and she had never had to call it twice. She called it 3 times. Hale's face went gray. He shouted for the men. It was Crail who came forward with a face like ash. "My lady, he was with me. 5 minutes ago. I turned my back to take a strap off a saddle, and when I looked up—" "Where, Crail?" "By the eastern stand of trees. He was watching the city." They ran. They found the wooden horse first, on its side in the trodden grass at the edge of the trees, 20 paces from the picket line, where a horse had stood very recently and where the prints of that horse went east, away from the camp, toward the city. There was a single small boot print beside it. A folded paper was tucked under the painted saddle. Mira unfolded it with shaking hands. The handwriting was a woman's. Sharp. Educated. The ink still wet. "The boy is safe. The boy will remain safe. So long as the king does not enter the city, he will be returned, unharmed, the morning after the succession. If the king attempts the gates, the tunnels, or any other way into Ravenrest, the boy will not be returned to his mother at all." There was no signature. Caleb was standing behind her. His face was the face of the man on the marble dais, and it was the face of the man in his grandfather's tower, and it was the face of a father who had just lost a son he had known for 3 days. She put the paper into his hand. He read it. They named the gates, the tunnels, and any other way. Caleb said quietly, "They know about the tunnel. The Marchwoods have had a longer reach inside our walls than we knew." "Then the tunnel is watched," Hale said. "They will not expect us to use it knowing it is watched. So we use it. They will have set a small trap, expecting a slow approach. We give them a fast one. We are in the tunnel within the hour." He looked at his city, 2 miles below them, lit with its red morning banners and its sealed gates. He looked at the city that his son had been carried into. "We ride." They rode in the dark. The plan had been a careful, hours-long approach. They threw it away in the grass at the edge of the trees, where the wooden horse had fallen. "They will not expect us before midnight," Hale said. They will expect us to sit in the camp and weep. The trap at the tunnel is a small one, set for a slow approach. We will not give them a slow approach. Then an hour. Mira rode beside Calum. She had not spoken since she had read the paper. There was a cold place in her chest where her son had been 20 minutes ago, and a sharper, brighter place behind her ribs where the bond was pulsing now, because somewhere in the city ahead of them, a small boy with golden eyes was still alive, and she could feel him. She had not understood, at first, that what she was feeling was him. A small, steady pulse, separate from the larger pulse of Calum's bond. She had stood in the trodden grass and she had understood, with the clarity of a woman who had carried a child in her body for 9 months, that she could feel where her son was. She rode beside Calum, and she let the small thread guide her. The eastern wall of Ravenrest came up out of the dark like a black cliff. The watch was sparse on this side. Hale led them to a broken outcrop of stones that looked like nothing. He pried at one of the stones with the point of his knife, and a section of the outcrop swung inward on a hinge that had been kept oiled for 19 years. The tunnel mouth was the height of a kneeling man. "My king first," Hale said. "Then the lady. Crail, you are with the king. The men hold the horses. If we are not back by the dawn bell, the others ride south." Calum nodded. He turned to Mira and put his hand against her cheek briefly. Then he ducked into the tunnel. She followed. They went on hands and knees for a long stretch. Then it rose and they could walk hunched. Then upright. Hale carried a small lantern hooded down to a sliver. The thread in her chest pulled steadily forward. They were closing on him. The tunnel ended at a stone trapdoor. Hale pushed it up slowly with his shoulder. A man was waiting for them at the top. He came out of the dark in the cellar with a blade. Hale's lantern caught his face for 1 instant. He was a Marchwood agent, the small scout left behind to send word the moment the trapdoor lifted. Hale was already moving. The two men met in the dark, and there was a short, ugly struggle, and the scout went down without making a sound. Quickly now. The corridors of the old armory wing were unlit. Hale knew them in the dark. They came to the stair. They climbed it. At the top, the household corridors began, lit, and they paused in the last shadow while Hale listened. 2 guards on the throne room door. Regular palace guard who do not yet know what their masters are doing. They will not fight us if we give them the order in the right voice. Calum nodded. He drew the slate cloak back from his shoulders. He looked at Mira. "I go in first. Hale behind me. You behind Hale, Crail at your shoulder. Whatever you see, do not move toward the boy until I tell you." "Yes." "Seraphina." "Yes. I love you." She put her hand on his chest. "I know." He stepped out of the shadow. The 2 guards at the throne room doors saw the king of Ravenrest, alive, walking down the corridor of his own palace with his sword drawn. The first dropped to 1 knee, the second drew breath to shout, and Hale's hand was over his mouth before the first sound left his throat. "Quietly," Calum said. "Open the doors." The kneeling guard rose. He looked just once at his king's face, the look of a man who had been told for 5 days that his king was dead and was now making a decision about which version of the truth he was going to die for. He chose. He drew the door open. Calum walked into the throne room. Every brazier was burning. Every chandelier was full of candles. The room had been prepared. The room was waiting for them. Lady Isolde Marchwood stood at the foot of the high dais in a gown of deep slate. Behind her, the throne stood empty. Behind the throne, on a plinth of black iron, sat a stone the size of a man's 2 fists. It was dark, a deep matte gray-black, and it pulsed with a light that was not light. It was the absence of light made visible. It was the severance stone. Mira felt the cold pressure of it the moment she saw it, and she understood why all the years the way they had felt had. Lady Isolde was holding Thorn by the hand. Mira's son stood at her side with his small back very straight. His golden eyes were on his mother across the lit hall, and they were calm. He was not crying. He was not afraid. He was looking at her with the small grave attention he gave to a tide pool. Lady Isolde smiled. "My king, how good of you to come home. We had nearly given you up for dead." Caleb did not speak. He walked into the center of the hall. Hale held position at his shoulder. Mira stepped past Hale against the order she had been given, and she walked forward until she was abreast of Caleb. "Let him go, Isolde." "Of course. The boy is a child. I will release him this very moment. You have only to do me one small courtesy first. Walk out of this room. You and the woman. Walk out tonight. The Chancellor will provide a quiet sum. The boy will be raised here, as the late king's heir. You will be permitted to write to him, twice a year. He will be a king, Caleb. He will be the king you should have been." "Mama," said Thorn. Mira looked at her son. "Mama, she is lying." The throne room went very still. Lady Isolde's smile did not change, but her hand tightened, just slightly, on his small hand. "Hush, child. The grown-ups are talking." "You are lying," Thorn said again, with the patient certainty of a child correcting an arithmetic mistake. "About the small sum, about the letters twice a year, about not being a monster. All of those things are lying, Mama." Lady Isolde's smile slipped. Then it was back. "What an imaginative little boy. And about the boy being a king. That one is a big lie, the biggest of the lies. She does not want me to be a king, Mama. She wants me to be a stone." The severance stone pulsed. It pulsed differently this time. The pulse stuttered, like the heart of a thing that had heard its own name spoken in a room in which it had not expected to hear it. The cold pressure faltered just for an instant, and through the gap, for one long heartbeat, the bond between Mira and Caleb opened all the way. Mira gasped. She had not known what a fully open bond felt like. The full open bond, when it broke through, was not a feeling. It was a flood. Caleb's whole interior life, every day of his searching, came through the open thread and into her chest at once. Beside her, Caleb staggered. He had felt the same thing from her side. The stone pulsed again, sharper, and the gap closed. But they had felt it. Lady Isolde's face had changed. She looked at the boy. She looked at the stone behind her. "Get him away from the stone," she said sharply to the shadows. The shadows moved. They had not been shadows. They had been men. 6 of them, in the dull dark cloaks of Marchwood agents. Hale shouted. Caleb was already moving. Mira ran for her son. Lady Isolde, who had never expected the scribe to be the kind of woman who simply ran at her, took half a step back and dragged Thorn with her. And Thorn, with the small, competent decisiveness of a 4-year-old, sat down. He went limp. He folded onto the marble like a small puddle of gray wool. Lady Isolde, off balance, lost her hold on his hand, and Mira was on him and had him. She lifted her son into her arms. He turned his face into her neck, then lifted it and looked over her shoulder. "Mama, she has a knife." Mira turned. Lady Isolde had a knife, a slim blade with a black handle. It was rising. Behind Mira, the throne room was full of the noise of swords. Caleb and Hale and Crail were in the center of the floor with the 6 Marchwood men around them. 2 of the 6 were already down. Lady Isolde stepped forward. "Give me the boy. He is the only thing alive that can break my family's stone." "No. He is 4 years old. He cannot make this choice. You can. Do not be sentimental." "He is 4 years old, Isolde. I would rather die 1,000 deaths than teach my son that love can be bargained for like grain. You took 4 months of me and 4 years of him. You will not take 1 minuter. Step back." Lady Isolde's pale eyes narrowed. "Then I will take him." She came at Mira with the small knife. Mira had never been a fighter. She had only her son in her arms and the severance stone 4 paces behind Lady Isolde. She moved. She turned, with her son in her arms, and she put her own back between the knife and her child. And she did the only thing she had ever been able to do that was a kind of magic. She stepped into the shadow behind the throne. The shadow gift had not left her. She stepped into the dim place behind the empty throne with her son in her arms, and she stepped out of the dim place at the side of the dais, 10 paces away, and Lady Isolde's knife came down on empty air. Mira set Thorn down at the foot of the side wall. "Stay here, my heart." "Mama, stay here." She turned. She crossed the dais at a run. She came up behind Lady Isolde, who had spun in confusion, and she shoved Lady Isolde Marchwood, with all the years of her exile behind the shove, sideways off the dais. Lady Isolde fell hard. The small knife went out of her hand. Mira turned to the severance stone. It pulsed at her. It pushed at her, the way a wind pushes at a door that has begun to open. She did not have a way to break it. She had only her hands. But behind her, on the side wall, her son was standing up. He was 4 years old. He had the small gray cloak muddied at the hem. He was walking across the marble floor of the throne room of Ravenrest with the small, careful steps of a child who had been told to stay where he was and who had decided, in the small private courts of his own 4-year-old judgment, that this once he would not. He came to the foot of the dais. He climbed it with his small hands on the marble. He came to stand beside his mother. He looked up at the severance stone. "Mama, it is lying about a great many things. It is lying about you and the kind man. It has been lying for a long time. Yes. I do not think that it should be allowed to keep lying." He reached up his small hand. He laid it, palm flat, against the side of the severance stone. The stone screamed. It was not a sound. There was no sound. There was only a great noiseless cry that ran through the throne room and into the bones of every living thing in it. The cry of a lie that has been named by a creature that knows the shape of truth at 4 years old. The pressure spiked. Calum, in the middle of the fight, dropped to one knee. Thorn kept his small hand on the stone. "You have lied long enough. You have lied to my mother and to my father and to the realm. I think you should stop now. Please." The stone cracked. The crack ran through it from the place where the small palm rested, all the way through the matte gray-black, all the way to the iron plinth. The thread widened, then forked, then ran branching through the whole body of the stone, and the cold pressure in her chest faltered, and then it broke. The severance stone shattered. It did not explode. It collapsed. It fell apart on its plinth in a slow ruin, into a pile of gray-black shards no larger than a thumbnail, and the noiseless cry stopped. The bond between Mira and Calum opened. It opened all the way and stayed open, and what came through it was not a flood, but a great calm river. And on the river was carried every hour that had been shouted across distance into silence. Calum dropped his sword. He came to her. The 4 remaining Marchwood men, who saw what had happened on their lord's face, dropped their swords at Hale's feet, because they were not paid enough for whatever was happening in this room. Calum reached the dais. He went to one knee in front of Thorn. He put his hand on the small dark head. "Thank you, my heart." Thorn patted his father's hand. "It was a very rude stone." Calum laughed. It came out of him as a sob and a laugh at once, and he gathered his son into his arms, and he reached his other arm for Mira, and the 3 of them were on the dais, with the broken stone behind them, and the bond was open. On the floor below, Lady Isolde Marchwood pushed herself up on one elbow. Her face had gone bone white. "You will all die for this," she whispered. "My family has reaches you have not begun to find." Calum looked at her over his son's head. His golden eyes were very calm. "Isolde, your family's reach ended in a 4-year-old's hand. It will not be coming back." The throne room doors at the far end of the hall burst open, and the regular palace guard came in at a run with their weapons drawn, and at the head of them was the captain of the household guard, a hard old wolf named Delwyn Rowe, who saw his king alive on the dais and went, immediately, to one knee. Behind him, his men did the same. Lady Isolde, at the foot of the dais, began very quietly to laugh. It was not a sane sound. Captain Rowe, take Lady Isolde Marchwood into custody. Send a company to House Marchwood, take the High Chancellor, the succession is cancelled. Yes, my king. And Rowe, send to the lower cell of the Marchwood seat. There is a young man held there, Crail's brother. He is to be brought up safely tonight, on Crail's hand, and not before any other. Yes, my king. And one further thing. Send for the High Magister. It was Hale who cleared the hall. The Marchwood agents were taken away in chains. Lady Isolde was taken away in irons. The shards of the severance stone were swept, with great care, into a leaden box that Hale had brought up from the armory, because no one in the room was sure, yet, whether the shards still carried any of the stone's old work in them. Crail rode out within the half-hour with a small detail, and 3 hours later he came back through the throne room doors with a thin young man on his arm, and Crail knelt with him in front of the king, and could not speak. And Calum laid his hand on Crail's bowed head and said only, "Welcome home, both of you." The High Magister came within the half-hour after. He was the same ancient man who had stood on the cathedral dais, and when he walked into the throne room and saw the King of Ravenrest standing on the dais with the dark-haired scribe and the small boy with golden eyes, his old face did a thing that was almost a smile and almost a weeping. He had known. Seraphina understood, looking at his face, that he had known, all those years, that something had been wrong. He had performed the joining because he had been pressed by men he had no power to disobey. He had carried the weight of that pressing. He set it down now. He came up the dais. He bowed to Calum, and then he bowed, more deeply, to Seraphina. "My lady, I have lived a long life. I had begun to fear I would die without seeing this. Magister, it would be my honor to serve as the witness, if it is your wish." "It is." He turned to Calum. "And your wish, my king?" "It has been my wish, Magister, for longer than I have words for." Seraphina gave Thorn to Hale to hold. The first beta took the boy with the careful gravity of a man who had been given, for the second time in his life, a charge he meant to keep. Thorn settled against Hale's shoulder with his small wooden horse, which Hale had recovered from the trampled grass at the edge of the trees. He laid his small, dark head against Hale's collar and watched his parents on the dais. Calum took Seraphina's hands in his own. He bared his throat to her. It was the old gesture, the wolf gesture, the moment of trust in which the stronger of a bonded pair offered, before witnesses, the most vulnerable place in his body to the teeth of the other. "Claim me, if you will, before the Magister and our son and the broken stone." Seraphina looked up at him. She had thought, in the long years of her exile, that if she ever saw this man again, she would have a great many words to say to him. She had no words now. She rose on her toes. She put her hand against the back of his neck. She brought his throat down to her mouth, and she pressed her lips to the place where his pulse beat hard against her, and then she set her teeth there, and she bit. The bond, which had opened when the stone broke, did the only thing it had left to do. It locked. What she had felt when the stone shattered had been the bond unsealed. What she felt now was the bond claimed, made permanent, written into both of them in a way that no artifact and no chancellor was ever going to undo. It came through her not as a flood and not as a river, but as a long, settling certainty. She felt every memory of his that he had carried for years, but this time she did not feel them as a storm. She felt them as a long, quiet shelf of books that were now hers to read at her leisure for the rest of her life. He felt the same of hers. She felt him let it go. She drew her teeth back from his neck. He bared his own teeth, and he drew her hair gently aside, and he set his mouth where the silver scar lay on her shoulder, and he renewed the claim he had made in the highest room of his grandfather's tower. The High Magister, when it was done, lifted his old hands. By the moon and the law of the pack, I have witnessed the bonding of Calum Draven of the Iron Fang line and Seraphina Vale, and I name this bond complete and lawful in the realm of Ravenrest. Hale set Thorn down on the dais. The boy walked to his parents. He stood between them, with one of his small hands in his mother's and the other in his father's, and he looked up at them in turn, and he was not a witness. He was the bond's own proof. The High Magister, seeing this, did something very rare. He laughed, very softly, with tears in his old eyes. He bowed. He left the hall. It was Thorn who broke the long silence afterward. "Mama, I am very tired. May I sleep now, please?" Calum lifted his son into his arms. Thorn put his head against his father's shoulder and closed his eyes between one breath and the next. He was asleep before they had crossed the hall. The councils met at dawn. It was not, in the end, a long meeting. The High Chancellor of Ravencrest had been taken from his bed in the small hours. He was the kind of man who broke in the third hour. By the time the sun cleared the eastern wall, he had given the council the full inventory of his family's plot, the names of every councilman who had been bought, the date and method of the drugging on the night of the joining, the full provenance of the severance stone. The council, which had spent the silent years pretending not to see what was happening to its king, did not pretend any longer. House Marchwood was attainted before the second bell. The High Chancellor was condemned by the unanimous vote of the council, and his sentence was carried out at noon. Lady Isolde was given her father's choice of fates and refused it. She demanded exile, and the council, with the king's consent, granted it. She was sent to the high islands of the northern sea, stripped of her name and her wolf and her right to ever set foot on the mainland again. The severance stone, in its leaden box, was buried at sea. Hale himself rowed it down to the harbor at Greycombe and put it aboard a ship under the charge of a captain he had trusted for 30 years, and the ship sailed into the deep grey water beyond the western cape, and the box was lowered, with weights, into a stretch of sea so deep that no chart of the realm marked its bottom. The realm righted itself around the king who had come back to it. That was the thing Seraphina had not expected. She had thought, in the years of her exile, that the kingdom of Ravencrest had moved on without her. She had not understood until she came home that the realm had been bleeding all that time, that the harvests had failed, that the wolves at the borders had grown thin and quarrelsome, that the rot had been the rot of a king who could not be whole. It healed. It healed faster than she would have believed. The harvests came in better than they had in years. The wolves at the borders settled. The cathedral was opened for a full season of public weddings, and the marble of the dais was scrubbed, and the marble forgot. And Seraphina, who had been Seraphina Vale and then Mira Aldenwood and was now, at last, simply herself, learned to be queen. She did not enjoy the title. She accepted it. She learned the names of the council members and the names of their wives. She learned the calendar of the audiences and the rhythm of the petitions. She learned, slowly, to use her old scribe's hand on documents of state, and the realm's archives, which had been a mess for 10 years, became, under her quiet attention, the archives the realm had been waiting for. Calum knew her shadow gift now. The bond made it impossible to hide anything, and neither of them wanted to. He let her come and go. She always came back. Thorn took the change in their lives in his small, careful stride. He learned the names of the household. He learned the names of the horses in the royal stables. He carried his wooden horse through the marble corridors with the same gravity with which he had carried it on the cobbles of Hollowmere. The kitchen women slipped him small honey cakes. The grooms taught him to sit a pony. Hale, who had no children of his own, became a kind of second father to him. He grew. He shot up that summer. He lost his small 4-year-old softness and acquired the longer lines of a 5-year-old, and then a 6-year-old, and his golden eyes, which had once stopped his father in a market square, became simply the eyes of a boy who lived in a palace and had a horse named Bramble. His gift did not leave him. By the time he was 7, he could walk into a council chamber and listen to a petitioner and know, without anyone telling him, when the petitioner was lying. He did not always tell. He had inherited, somewhere in his careful judgment, the wisdom that a truth-seer who tells every truth he sees is a truth-seer who quickly has no friends. He told only the lies that mattered. In the second autumn after the breaking of the stone, Seraphina knew herself with child again. She told Caleb that night in the carved tower, with his hand on her belly the way she had once practiced, in the days of Renfell, telling him the first time. He had wept, very quietly, into her hair. He had sat with her at the windowsill where her old name was carved into the granite, and he had laid his palm over the letters, and he had said, "We will give this one a name we both choose." From the start. Their daughter came in the spring. She came in the queen's chambers, with the household midwife and Caleb's own hand in Seraphina's hand, and she came easily, after a short labor, and she was small and dark-haired, and, when she opened her eyes, they were the deep gray of her mother's eyes. Seraphina wept when she saw the color. She had not known how much she had wanted to give one of her children her own face. Caleb kissed her forehead. He took the small bundle in his arms. He looked down at his daughter with the look Seraphina had first seen on his face in the alcove of the cottage at the end of the cliff lane. "Hello, my heart. Welcome home." They named her Linnea, after Seraphina's grandmother, who had taught a small girl in the pine forests of the eastern coast how to step from one darkness to another. 6 years passed. The realm of Ravenrest, in its 6th summer after the breaking of the severance stone, was a kingdom that had learned to be at peace. The harvests had come in well. The roads were safe. The merchants traveled. The cathedral was scrubbed. The council met every fortnight and disagreed, sometimes loudly, with the king on the smaller matters, and never on the great ones, because the great ones had been decided in a throne room with a small boy's hand on a stone. It was not a perfect kingdom. There were poor harvests in the southern provinces in the 3rd year. There was a flux in the western towns in the 4th. There was a small border skirmish with the high mountain packs in the 5th, settled by Caleb himself in 3 weeks. There were the ordinary griefs of a kingdom of living people. But the kingdom did not bleed. It had stopped the night the stone broke, and it had not started again. In the high room of the carved tower on a summer evening, the Queen of Ravencrest sat in the deep window seat with her head against her bonded mate's shoulder. The carved tower had been opened again. Seraphina had gone up alone, the first time, in the 2nd week after her return, and she had stood at the windowsill and traced, with her fingers, the letters cut into the granite. Her old name, cut by Caleb's own knife on a night so far gone now that it almost belonged to another woman. She had wept, at the windowsill, for that other woman. The young scribe with ink-stained fingers who had believed a king's whispers and paid for them with the long road of her life. She had wept for her without bitterness, the way an older woman weeps for a younger one she remembers but is no longer. This evening was a summer evening. The window was open. The air smelled of the cut hay from the fields beyond the city, and of the warm stone of the tower, and, very faintly, of the sea. There was a small knock at the door. "Mama." "Come in, my heart." Thorn came in. He was 10 years old that summer. He had grown long. He had his father's height already. He was going to be a tall man. His dark hair fell across his forehead. His golden eyes were still, the gold of his father's wolf form. But they had settled into him now, as if his face had finally grown into them. He carried a book under his arm. He carried, in his other hand, his small wooden horse, which he no longer played with, but which he had not given up either. He climbed up into the window seat with them. He was almost too long to fit in the way he had once fit, but he made himself fit. He laid his head on his mother's other shoulder opposite his father. "Mama, will you tell me again?" "Tell you what, my heart?" "The story of how Papa found us." Serafina looked over the dark crown of her son's head at the man on her other side. Calum's golden eyes met hers. There was a small private smile on his mouth. He had been waiting for this. He had been waiting for the night their son was old enough to ask for the whole story, in full, and not the soft shapes of it that they had told him in his small years. "All right," Serafina said. "I will tell you, my heart, from the beginning." She drew breath. There was a great hall in a city, far from here, where the bells rang for an hour, and in the high gallery of the hall, where no one was looking, there was a young woman who had hidden herself behind a pillar of gray stone. She was a scribe. She had ink on her fingers. She had a secret in her belly that she had not yet told. And the man she loved, on the dais below her, was about to take another woman's hand. Thorn settled deeper against her shoulder. "Tell me about the cup." There had been a cup. The High Chancellor had pressed it into the king's hand at the 3rd hour after sunset. The wine in it was very dark and very sweet, and the king did not taste anything wrong in it. By the time the bells began to ring, the king's eyes had gone empty. "Tell me about the moment you knew you were going to leave." "It was when he said her name. When he said the name on the dais. I had told myself until that moment that some part of him would still see me. He had a way, your father, of seeing people. It is what I had loved before I had loved anything else about him. When he said her name, and his eyes stayed empty, I understood that I had a choice. I could stay and break my heart in front of every soul in the cathedral, or I could go and break it where no eye could see. I chose to go. And the shadow. And the shadow. I had not used my grandmother's gift in many years. I used it that night, at the foot of my cot. I stepped out of the palace into the southern shadow of the wall. I did not look back at the lit windows. "Tell me about the long road." "It was long. It was quiet. I had a son. I built a library. I learned the names of the children of the boat captains. I taught them their letters. I made tea in the mornings with mint from a small herb garden, and I pressed my hands flat against the back garden wall when the tightness came, and I told myself every morning that I would be all right. Were you all right?" "I was, my heart. I was not happy, but I was all right. I had you." Thorn nodded very slightly against her shoulder. "Tell me about the day." She looked at Calum. He looked at her. The bond, 6 years sealed now, hummed between them. It was the small private music of their lives. Calum, this time, took up the telling. He told their son about riding into the cobbled square of Hollowmere on a slate-gray afternoon, with no expectation of finding anything. About hearing the small voice of a 6-year-old call a name across a square. About lifting his head and looking down a row of cottages and seeing, in the open shutter of one of them, a small dark-haired boy with eyes the color of his own wolf form. "And what did you do?" "I forgot how to breathe. And then? And then I walked across the square. I left the harbor master in the middle of his sentence. I walked to the cottage at the end of the cliff lane. I knocked on the door. And Mama opened it. And then there was a crossbow bolt. And then there was a crossbow bolt. And then," Thorn said, with the air of a boy reaching the part he had loved best for as long as he could remember, "you came inside, and you saw me, in the alcove, and you cried, and I said you were sad inside." "You did." Thorn smiled, very faintly, against his mother's shoulder. "I do not remember saying it. You said it. I remember the wooden horse. You held it the whole time. I remember that you had been carrying a heavy thing for a long time, Papa. I had never seen anyone carry a heavy thing that old before. Caleb did not answer at once. When he did, his voice was very quiet. I had been carrying it for a long time, my heart. You were the first person who saw it. I never forgot it. In the yard below, a small dark-haired girl was running on the cobbles after a gray kitten, with her grandmother's pendant bouncing on a thin chain at her neck and her braid coming loose. Linnea, who was 6 that summer, ran with the focused fury of a 6-year-old in pursuit of something small and quick. Hale's voice, somewhere out of sight, called her name with the patient long-suffering of a man who had become, in his older years, the chief defender of the Queen's children against their own consequences. In the yard beyond, the kitchen lamps were beginning to be lit. Serafina looked out of the window, over her son's dark head, at the long slope of her city in the gold summer light. She thought, as she sometimes thought on these evenings, of the woman she had been in the western gallery of the cathedral, the woman who had pressed her hand to her belly and her sleeve to her mouth, and walked, very carefully, down 2 flights of servant stairs to a small chamber above a scriptorium. She did not regret the long road. That was the strange thing. She had thought, in the first year after coming home, that she would feel the road as a wound. She had felt it, instead, as a road that had been walked. The road had carried her from one woman into another. The woman she had been at the frosted window had not been ready to be Queen of Ravenrest. The woman who had pressed her hands flat against a back garden wall in a coastal town had become, in the carrying of her son and the keeping of her grief, the woman who could. The road had not been taken from her. It had made her. She looked at her son. She looked at her bonded mate. She looked through the open window, down at the yard where her daughter was running on the cobbles after a gray kitten in the gold summer light. She thought very simply that she was home. "Tell me the end, Mama," Thorn said sleepily. "You know the end, my heart. Tell me anyway." She drew breath. And after a long road, and a small tunnel, and a stone that was lying, and a small boy who told it to stop lying, the king of Ravenrest and the scribe he had loved stood on the dais of the throne room, with their son between them, and the bond, which had been kept from them, opened all the way. And it stayed open, and it has not closed since. And it never will, and it never will. And we lived, Thorn said, with the gravity of a 10-year-old finishing a story he had owned since he was 4. In the high room of the carved tower, and in the Queen's chambers, and in the old library, and in the eastern fields, when the harvests were good, and we were happy. Yes, my heart. Mama, Papa, I love you, both of you, very much. Caleb reached his long arm across the back of the window seat and laid his hand on his son's dark head. He did not speak. He did not need to. The bond carried the answer for both of them, and Thorn, who had been able to read his parents' silences since he was 4 years old, smiled, very faintly, against his mother's shoulder. Below them, in the yard, Linnea finally caught the kitten for the 2nd time. The kitchen lamps were lit, one by one, along the eastern wall. The bell of the cathedral rang the 7th hour, slow and even in the gold summer evening. In the high room of the carved tower, with her son's dark head against her shoulder and her bonded mate's hand on the boy's hair, and the long line of her city laid out below the open window, Serafina Vale, who had once vanished into the dark and been hunted across years by a man whose name she had thought she would never speak again, closed her eyes for one quiet moment. When she opened them, the gold light had turned to rose. The story, the one that had begun in a great hall far away and long ago, had reached at last the page on which it would rest. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this story.